All right, so Google's suggesting that I paint some rocks for you today, just so you can see the techniques and the stages to go through. Stages are pretty much the same as my previous videos. The three stages are essentially a color blocking, a saturation and contrast, and then the final detail and structure. So I'm starting out this video with a drawing. I have three rocks. Oh, sorry. I have four rocks on the tabletop, kind of arranged. I'm going to do a quick sketch, get them in place. Nothing real fancy, just a real rough outline. And then I'll start blocking and prepping, starting with the background. And I'm working with my little travel palette, little set that I bought off of Amazon. It's really just a student grade watercolor pan set. And I'm working with, again, a rather inexpensive Strathmore paper, nothing fancy. Normally when I'm teaching my students in my illustration class, my drawing class, or my watercolor classes, and we're working with wet media, I'll work with, or try to work with, the same level of tools that they are working with, just to make sure that they understand that it isn't necessarily all about the tools or the paints. It's about the knowledge and the skills you're bringing to bear and your understanding of the paper, the brushes, and the pigments. So this pigment set has a pretty nice ability to be thinned down without losing its consistency. It doesn't get grainy. And right now you can see I'm just blocking in wet on wet. Right now I started out wet on dry, but blocking in the colors while they're still wet. Dropped in some cools, have the rounds going, and I'm coming after the shapes, the colors inside on the shapes of the rocks themselves. So that was stage one. Now it's dried, and we're on to stage two, and we're going to start intensifying shapes, saturate the color a little bit, find the planes on the rocks. These rocks, I picked a variety of rocks out, some rounded rocks with some soft transitions from one plane to another. I found a nice flat little piece of limestone, and it has some very nice sharp planier changes. I'm dropping in shadows right now. And all of this saturation, the intensifying of the colors, just trying to find shapes and forms, create some modeling, get that 3D form to read properly. There goes a plane right on the front side of that flat piece of limestone. It's the contrast that will start making the objects appear three-dimensional. The modeling, trying to get the grooves, the textures. We'll just keep working our way through making color complexities, adding warm and cool colors together, wet on wet. Okay, I'm jumping over to that far right piece of rock, that stone, and it's more of a burnt sienna color. So I'm just dropping in, trying to get a modulation to the surface using burnt sienna, dropping that color up. I'm going to mix up some blue colors, throw it down in on the shadow side. Looks like I'm going after the shadows again. I'm lifting right there, mixing the colors. I have a damp brush, just lifting colors. So it's always a constant push and pull of of sharp edges and soft edges, laying colors down. It's still fairly thin color, so it dries lighter. I really like how the background dried, that initial color blocking with the colors running together. I've got some nice interactions right in around the rocks with the green and the warm colors, that blue green. And I really love that little piece right down on the bottom. So it looks like I'm doing a lot of talking. I'm doing a voiceover on top of the video right now. So we're into stage 3 right now. I've grabbed a smaller brush, mixed up some thicker colors, and I'm really going after structure, adding in contrast, and building that definition between the objects and getting edges, and really that contrast is going to start popping those rocks. And once I get that established, I'll come after the textures, the range of textures and the details, the surface modulations on the rocks themselves. So right now I'm doing a little drawing with a fine brush just to get some of that structure established. The darkest darks that I have and that I'm looking at. So I was just checking to see if I had a wet spot I could lay my hand onto. I didn't want to find a wet spot and smear stuff. All right, so now I'm layering in another bit of burnt sienna, maybe a little burnt umber into it, just to get a little more of the color saturation on that right rock. Yeah, this rock out of the 4 rocks, this one was giving me the most problems. So it was kind of a hot mess for the bulk of the time I was working on it. I'd lay stuff on it and let it dry and go back to it. So, but the other rocks, they cooperated a little more in the development. All right, still again, still working on planes. There's some really nice striations and planes on that flat piece of limestone. I'm doing a little cool work right on the edge of that white highlight that I left from the background to the object. And I'm going to come after a little more saturation on that far left rock. Again, it was more of a rounded rock, so the transitions from one plane to the other, they're a little softer. They kind of have a nice feathered feel to them. And again, just building up layering and that whole sense of data that you're adding into your piece. All right, so I'm working in a little more of the detail on the surfaces, still bouncing around the whole piece. As if one rock is wet, I'll jump over to another rock and work in some of those details, those crevices, those edges, some textures, making some texture marks, intensifying saturation. And even though this is a small little study of a watercolor, I have this running at about 2 times the normal speed, just so we can get through it quicker. You can still see what I'm doing. I'm adding some contrast into the crevices, getting those darkest areas on the surface of that rock over there. Working some edges, the shadow edges, a little more contrast. Looks like a warm umber and sienna mixture. Okay, again, another layer, trying to get that density to come up. Those glazes, those thin tea washes. This one's a little more of a gray, a little more blues in this, trying to get the shadow sides to read a little cooler. In this rock right now, bears no resemblance to the actual rock on the tabletop. Again, I'm not trying to be absolutely realistic to the rocks. I'm just trying to paint rocks. So I'm not being terribly true to the colors, the actual colors. I have a rough indication. The limestone's kind of yellowish, and that far right rock is definitely a burnt umber, but that left rock is still needing some development as I'm working around trying to get other details. I'll come back to that and deal with it here in a few minutes. Okay, working on shadows, those really dark sides of the in definition of the rock from the table surface. And now I'm going to go after that one rock. And I'm working in actually kind of an unexpected color choice, but I thought some purples, some reds, a little more warmth on of a different type than an earth tone would work on that left rock. And I'm back to glazing a little more of the burnt sienna on the little rock in the foreground, dropping some of the greens on top. There is definitely a tinge of green on the rock. So now I'm just adding again that level of variation of color. And that rock on the left is really wet at this point. So I'll drop a little more in. I'm touching up some of the softening some of the edges and letting that dry, trying not to overwork it. So at this point, so I think I have all three or all four rocks wet, so I just need to let it dry. And then I'm going to come back in. Once it's dry, and now it's dry, we're going to come in and I'm going to use my toothbrush and simply hold my hand and cup it so I'm not splattering on the background. I'm going to add some textures to the rocks. All right. It's still working. Bringing up. So I'm going to do a little more flat brush, a little more angling that brush down, getting some textures now. So these are definitely textural marks while also intensifying saturation, some contrast. And you can see I'm working to try to rescue that rock. It's that rock on the left or on the right is that rock on the right is a hot mess. So I'm working on it. Yeah, I'll get it there. I'm really liking the purple greenish tinge on that far left rock. It's looking nice. The textures look good. In thicker paint, I'm working in, trying to get those crevices to pop. If you want something light, if you want something to look light in your piece, you have to contrast it with something dark. And right now there's not a lot of white highlights on any of the objects in here, so they all have a tint of color to some degree. I'm just dropping in more textural marks, irregular marks, trying to be as irregular as possible. I'm drawing. All right, dropping in some more crevices, edges, sharp edges. Trying not to do too many sharp ones on that left rock, but there are some divots and sharper shapes on the surface. Yep, textural marks, creases, crevices right there. Intensify that edge slightly. Bounce over to the other one. Getting some pretty good planes over there. But I definitely feel like that far right rock is because I am having some issues with it. I'm definitely overworking it. And a lot of times when I do overwork a piece, I may just let that dry. And I think if I remember correctly, I'll come in and probably just reactivate some of the spaces and even out some of the work that has gone on in the various spaces. All right, I'm getting ready to do something. Flat brushing here. I'm going to get some texture marks here using the paper surfaces and the direction of that top plane. So definitely holding that brush very low, a very low angle, and scrubbing across it to get some textures. All right, mixing up some cools, coming in after those shadows again, adding that coolness into the shadow side, intensifying. I'm working with a pan set of colors, and I tend to do a lot more glazing with pans. I just have a more difficult time getting the saturation just right with pans, and so it tends to be in a tea to coffee to milk state as I'm starting to add the detail. But it gets a lot more difficult to get to the cream and butter state with a pan set than with a tube set. So, and I'm again just bouncing around, getting my rocks wet everywhere. So I'm trying to come up with a plan for that right rock, bringing in the shadows, nice cool shadows, intensifying the shadows underneath the rocks, underneath where the one rock is leaning on the other. Again, I'm not worried about it looking exactly like the rocks that I have on the tabletop. They're just more as there as inspiration I can draw from to find the shadows and get the right kind of crevices and surface textures onto the piece. Okay, so now I have a damp brush. I'm coming back in on this rock that's been giving me, it's my problem child. So I'm coming in and lifting. I'm doing some work on the interior shapes, trying to simplify some of the washes and glazes that I've done, and pulling up some highlights again just to get a little more surface modulation to the rock and try to pull it back up. So thinking some directional marks and get a couple more highlight edges along some of those creases and bumps that are on the surface of it. So really don't get frustrated. If something's not working out, just be patient with it, let it dry, and think of your options. What can you do to maybe try to pull that and rescue it from disaster? And once it dries with your picking, see there, I got a nice big shape there. Those are dry over there. I'm going to let that big rock on the right dry a little bit, and I'm going to come back over. I'm working on the shadows. There we go. And that big rock on the right is drying. That big spot in the center is very wet, so it needs to dry a little bit before anything can happen with it structurally. There are some dry spots on it. I can still touch it up and do some things. I'm crossing some of those bumps and crevices across the plane changes that oftentimes reads really nicely on a rock. Yep, intensifying those edges. There we go. Adding some surface, some textures into that big space. Get some little more striation on that one. Popping a little contrast up on that top edge of the flat rock. All right, now I'm getting some burnt umber again. And oh, there we go. I'm working in a little more contrast onto the background edge against the highlights of the rocks, and then softening it up, feathering out that color with just water. And lastly, I'm going to mix up some greens, and I thought that nice thin wash of green right against the edge of that purple would look really nice. Nice color interaction between the two, the background and the foreground. And again, I'm always trying to make with the backgrounds, even though I'm on a brown piece of paper with my actual rocks, the watercolor has a lot of variation of colors. So that's it, sports fans. That's 4 rocks done in watercolor with one that was trying to become a train wreck. You know, I'm trying to paint a watercolor while filming a video. So that's a whole new experience for me in this last couple of months as I'm getting my YouTube channel started. I want to thank you for watching this video. And if you think you got any value out of it, please give me a like and a subscribe. I much appreciate your support. I'll see you in the next video. See you soon.